You're watching Reality Check. The escalation of the government's battles with Twitter over Twitter's refusal to comply fully with the government's orders on banning or blocking handles or accounts appears to be missing the wood for the trees. On the face of it, we have a government aggrieved that a social media giant is not taking down insightful content. On the other, we have a social media platform, Twitter, showing a rare display of spine in resisting, at least partly, the government's diktat and speaking up for free speech. Alas, both sides can be held guilty of double standards. Social media platforms actually repeatedly fall short of regulating hate and misinformation on their platforms, all the more when it comes to the regime of the day. Recall the Wall Street Journal story from August last year on how Anki Das, a key official in Facebook India who has since quit, prevented action against a hate-spreading BJP MLA, Facebook only acting belatedly after the story appeared. Then there's an alt news piece from October last year reported on how most of Facebook's fact-checking partners in India fall short of fact-checking BJP-led misinformation. Just today, a viral video on YouTube, and these are screenshots from it, claiming to expose a sinister plot behind the violence on Republic Day during the farmers' protest, called for the hanging of a number of journalists. The video only taken down after it had garnered close to 500,000 views. Now, this is not even taking into account the countless instances of hateful commentary and hashtags that routinely trend on Twitter, celebrating the Babri demolition, for instance, every time December 2nd rolls around, or hashtags glorifying Nathuram Godse on the death anniversary of Mahatma Gandhi. So the conduct of social media giants in policing hate on their platforms is far from perfect. But the government's displeasure against Twitter is equally duplicitous. Given that the official crackdown on insightful content only seems to be provoked when the content is seen as critical of the government or politically uncomfortable to the ruling party. Even in this latest case, the government's anger seems to be that Twitter didn't go far enough in blocking handles reporting on critical farmers' protests. Remember, as per the official narrative, the government request to Twitter was meant to only target those handles using a provocative hashtag about the PM planning farmers' genocide. But as we know, that request resulted in a much wider initial purge, where even the Twitter handle of the news magazine Caravan, known for its critical pieces on the current regime, was also briefly withheld before Twitter restored it. Fundamentally, the government's actions will be seen through the lens of bad faith, given that it and the ruling party preside over a vast machinery of misinformation and hate, online and offline. Remember, this is the same government whose ministers have publicly called for traitors to be shot with goalies, videos of those hate speeches going viral. Did the government call for those videos to be taken down or for action against the hate mongers? This alt news piece cites multiple instances to make the case that the head of the ruling party's IT cell is a ringmaster of propaganda and misinformation, regularly pushing out or amplifying fake news, often insightful communal fake news. Any demand for action against those tweets or against the IT cell chief? We know the answer. Which is why Twitter's sudden discovery of spine or the government's concern over insightful content will be taken with a large dose of salt. And amid all of this, it appears that the government has now framed draft rules that seek to exercise even more sweeping control over online content. This will include social media, messaging services, streaming platforms, and news outlets. These new rules attempt to regulate Facebook, Twitter, WhatsApp, Netflix, Amazon Prime, news websites, and much more. The proposals include that based on a court or government order, social media platforms have to take down content within 36 hours. Again, based on a court or government order, messaging services will need to identify the first originator of information. Social media platforms are meant to appoint a chief compliance or nodal officer who is meant to be available 24/7 to complaints from government agencies. Online platforms will be asked to adhere to a government code of ethics. Anyone under these guidelines can be designated as a social media intermediary akin to Facebook or Twitter. The conditions are to comply the sovereignty and integrity of India, which many are saying is just also being sometimes invoked in a sweeping manner to regulate content. These new rules advocate for self-regulation, but there is a question about whether that's the real intent, or is it to further extend the government's ambit of control into even those areas of online content which have so far hitherto been unpoliced. All right. Joining me tonight on the panel, I have with me Rahil Khurshid. He's co-founder Laminar Global. He is also formerly a member of Twitter India. I have with me Chinmay Arun, who's fellow of the Information Society Project in Yale. Shreya Singhal, an advocate who's been dealing with questions of online regulation. Vivek Tankha, Rajya Sabha MP of the Congress, who's also a member of the Standing Committee of Joint Parliamentary Committee, I beg your pardon, on digital privacy. And Chandrakumar Bose, former Vice President and Senior Leader, BJP West Bengal. Shreya Singhal, let me start with you. That is there a fundamental problem here that when the government starts to actually get into this battle with Twitter and other social media platforms ostensibly to regulate or to filter out insightful content, there is this question of what its true intent is. Is it genuinely concerned about these aspects, or does its own track record raise this question of double standards?
There seems, at least appears to be in the actions taken over the past, say, 5 years, that it is all geared towards the government only propagating a type of propaganda and trying to take down everything else that, you know, that is critical of the government. And the type of action which is taken to someone who is not aligned to the ruling party, especially the BJP, is swift, it is excessive, and it is slowly, by each takedown notice seems to be killing the democracy, because there is a fear and a blackmail that is happening what is being said is, and the effect of this is that don't talk or else keep quiet. We don't want to hear your views, and if it's not in line with ours, then you suffer the consequences.
Right. Rahil, but there's also the other side to it. I mean, it's obviously hard to get people who are currently serving in Twitter to come on shows on platforms like this. But since you worked from the inside, now that you're out of it, I don't know how much you can share with us both sides of this, both the fact that the government only seems to get proactive when it comes to politically uncomfortable content, and also the fact that platforms like Twitter often end up either playing ball or do a very poor job of actually regulating hate.
Vasu, two sides to the question, right? Like in context to what a government chooses a particular platform to keep or take down from a particular platform, right? In context to this, the hashtag that's at the center of the controversy, so to speak, has been removed. Its visibility has been dimmed, and some of the accounts that have tweeted the hashtag have been taken down. The Twitter, before it sort of like went into a legal huddle, so to speak, to get advice, did comply with the order, only to reverse some of that action, realizing that the order was excessive.
Right.
The government's positioning, of course, that it's an order from the government, so it needs to be complied with. But just because it's an order from the government doesn't necessarily make it legal, first of all. And Twitter's action, reinstating, say, famously the account of Caravan, for example.
Yes.
And it is quite incredulous that an account like Caravan was suspended in the first place.
That's right.
Is within the legal limits of options available to Twitter within the constitutional limits of India.
Right. No, that's fair enough, Rahil. I guess what I'm trying to ask you is that from your own time there, were you able, what was all of this something that you were also privy to, that you would get requests from the government that would only be targeted towards, in a sense, censoring one side, but also the fact, Rahil, that Twitter, quite apart from government requests, is on its own not very good at policing hate. What did you see from as an insider? How did that play out?
So having a ringside view to these conversations from my 5 odd years at Twitter between 2014 to 2018, look, each government tries to manipulate platforms in the way that works best for them. So none of the governments that we've had, so to speak, have been especially friendly to dissent. But what is interesting is the transparency report that Twitter has put out in the last few quarters, and the numbers have dramatically shot up. So Twitter catalogs every request that it gets from the government,
right,
for a takedown or an account removal or an account withholding or content withholding and so on and so forth. And those numbers have dramatically shot up.
Right.
That's one. The second is the Twitter self-regulating itself, or Twitter doing a better job of regulating conversation on its own platform.
Yes.
And I'll say this with some amount of sort of caution that while a lot of work remains to be done in this field, because speech is constantly evolving, like hate speech on platforms is constantly evolving, and it's a bit of a catch-em-all game, right? Twitter has, in the last few years, done a fairly decent job of introducing, features on the product side that do a better job of this, and it has parallelly the conversation around free speech on social platforms has also evolved. It's a moving conversation. We saw in the US the deplatforming of Donald Trump, right? Like that comes at a particular moment where the conversation about free speech is at a fairly advanced stage when it comes to social platforms.
Right. I'm just jumping in here because I need to move on, but you would understand why many people listening to you would be raising their eyebrows in near disbelief, because it may be a better job compared to earlier, but Twitter, particularly Indian Twitter, remains a river of hate and unchecked bigotry and misinformation, and that's a big problem. And often there is an accusation of double standards between how Twitter deals with these situations, not just Twitter, but other social media giants in the West compared to countries like India. But Chandra Bose, the fact is, let me come back to you. Chandra Bose, the fact is that there is this bad faith about the government and the BJP when they seem to get all self-righteous about containing insightful hashtags or hate, because as I just listed, your party, sorry to say, has a major investment in the fake news, misinformation and hate industry, starting with your IT cell chief.
You see, freedom of expression and speech are enshrined in the Constitution of our country. So we could use the social media, we could use the electronic media, you are part of it, and express our views.
But that's not my point.
No, I'm coming to that.
My point is simple. My point is, how can you, in good faith, ask Twitter and other social media to say, take down this content or that content, when it's clearly partisan? It's only content which is either going against the government or party narratives. The BJP, its allies, its ecosystem continues to push out fake news and hate and bigotry, and there's no action against any of it.
See, Twitter and other social media platforms, they have a code of ethics. You see, you need to judge when an expression...
But what about the BJP's own code of ethics? That's what I'm asking.
See,
what about BJP, your leaders who make hateful speeches and there's no action against them? What about your party leaders who tweet fake news and there's no action against them? That's what I'm asking.
And I don't think my party leadership would accept any leader of our party making any hate speeches against anyone or any community. That is not the culture, at least that is not what our leader Narendra Modi ji stands for.
Chandra Bose, my dear Chandra Bose, the current junior minister of finance, we saw what he said. Was there any action against him? No.
Well,
Kapil Mishra, I mean, the list of hate-mongering politicians is long and wide, and that's why when you say we want to control social media, we need to regulate online content, that's why it just, who would buy that that your intent is genuine?
You see, you have to understand in what context that comment was made. Any case, that comment shouldn't have been in the first place. But you must understand in the heat of the moment.
It was made.
And in the kind of environment that
Well, that's not a
made,
justification.
You need to understand that.
No, okay, can I move on? I'll come back to you.
It's a lapse.
I'll come back to you. Vivek Tankar,
the
the fact is that whether it's the BJP or the Congress, as Rahid was saying, even during the UPA time, it's not as if the track record on how you approach social media was any different.
Srinivasan, I look at this whole thing differently.
Okay.
You know, this is the new world order. Twitter, Facebook, Instagram.
Yes.
This is the new world order. World over, the countries need to recognize it. One, they also need to fall in line with the domestic laws. That is because if you want entry and access to countries, countries will insist on some compliance with domestic law.
Yes.
But the problem with India today is that our record of closing doors to these international agencies, whether it be International Human Rights Commission, Amnesty International, Twitter, Facebook, I mean, the way we are behaving with them, it takes away the confidence that the democracy is in safe hands. Freedom of speech and expression is enshrined in Article 19. Restrictions can only be on ground of sovereignty, threat to sovereignty, integrity, and something very drastic.
No, I think the point,
no,
Vivek Tankar, hold on. The point I'm trying to make is that it's no one's case, certainly not mine, that these social media giants don't need some kind of oversight. It's just that when the oversight, particularly government oversight, comes through a political prism, when you have a government or a regime that is also so invested in ensuring that only a certain kind of narratives is pushed on these platforms, then that oversight becomes deeply problematic.
Srinivasan, do we really have a law to control these platforms? We have an IT Act of 2020 in which you are invoking Section 69A.
Yes.
How much does it even apply in the facts of these cases? I mean, today there is a need for a new regime, but that regime cannot be left to the government completely. You need to have neutral adjudicators. You need to have people who would understand it in the national prism.
Okay.
Today, what the government does it, any government, I'm not doing, today BJP is doing it whole hog, that they stop their own criticism, political criticism, they use these laws. Now, this has to be properly regulated, I am sure.
Okay,
all
you're
these
saying
actions,
neutral
if ever
adjudicators
taken.
as well. Okay, Chinmay Arun.
Of course, that is the need of the hour.
Chinmay Arun, what's the way out of this? Are there any instances of global best practices where you can have oversight of these social media platforms but don't come with such a lens of political prejudice or agendas?
There are a few experiments and there are some suggestions out there. The problems that you describe are problems that many countries are struggling with. And I think that it's helpful to think of them in terms of two different sets of issues. One is a question of the platforms and what they permit and how much caution, how much effort they exercise in making sure that their content doesn't contain too much incitement to violence, Myanmar being a classic example. And then on the other hand, you have a question of that you just flagged of politicians pushing the platforms so far that they affect our right to know. I think in this whole conversation about freedom of speech, we forget that in India particularly, our right to freedom of expression is also defined as a right to know, which means that the public is affected when speech is censored. And so towards this, Facebook's been experimenting with this new oversight board of experts. So this is a global set of experts that includes one Indian, one Pakistani, among other things. And they are making an attempt to look at select difficult cases like the Trump ban,
Right.
and offer their expert opinion on how this needs to be balanced. So that's one kind of thing that they're trying.
Yeah.
On the other hand, they're trying to use algorithms to get a little better at doing this on scale.
Right.
And if people were to dispute, so I've critiqued this a little bit myself. I've said that this is self-regulation, and I don't know if you want platforms to control this process
Yes.
to this degree. The UN Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Expression, David Kay, had suggested that we might try and use global social media councils modeled on press councils, which would be a
Interesting.
multi-stakeholder system. Yeah.
Okay. But at the moment, though, Shreya Singhal, I don't know whether we are close to any of that. What we have, as I said at the outset, is this escalating battle between the government and social media platforms, and these new set of guidelines which they're proposing, you might have also had a chance to have a look at them, are actually seeking to extend the government's remit, not just over what are called social media intermediaries like Facebook and Twitter, but extending into streaming services, all of that.
So the thing is that the way this escalation is going, I see it ending in two ways. That the Indian Indian-made app Coup becomes a victor out of this, and I actually just wanted to compare the terms of service of Coup, where Coup in its last published on the 1st of January 2021. The term is that they have prior to publication of any content, they can regulate as well as remove and choose to remove and not publish that content. So there is it is not an application to freely express yourself, because there is someone controlling it. Who that someone is dangerous. Okay. And that there is a censorship as a prerequisite to publish. So you are already being censored with whatever the line is being given to them. So that is very dangerous. And with respect to Twitter, I think Twitter is just one entity in a line of, the entire, all of the social media giants, so to speak. And I think that the more pervasive this type of control gets, the vaguer it's getting, and the more power is being given to the government to twist it. And whoever that government may be, it's not a UPA, it's not a BJP, it is even at that state level.
Any government, absolutely.
Any government, and there will be so much. We will end up in a political cold war of the government versus its citizens, where, everyone is fighting and you don't know what is happening.
Right. So that's the challenge, Raheel, that you have social media giants who have commercial interests, you have governments that have their political interests, and it's very hard to try to see what's the way out. I mean, at least for the moment, Twitter seems to be putting some of those concerns aside and appears to be taking some sort of a stand. But again, as someone who's been privy from the inside, how far do you think Twitter will be prepared to go? Because, there is this constant threat that its officials could be called, hauled up and arrested. Are they willing to take that risk, you think?
Look, it's basically we're going to have to wait and watch. But I think from what Twitter has put out in the blog post that it just did, it's not going to back down. It's because this is going to set a precedent, right? Like what you don't want to be doing is every order that the government sends your way, you comply with that order blindly, whether that compliance is justified or not.
Okay.
So, and it's going to be assuming, there are two strands to this conversation. One strand is this whole notion of building homegrown apps and so on and so forth. And Shreya pointed to the black swan effects that, events like demonetization or a TikTok ban or the confrontation the government has with Twitter has on homegrown apps.
Right.
But it's also important to notice that you can either sort of, go all the way. Why have a pretense that the borders are free in that sense for anyone to come and do what they want to do from a tech point of view? Like either build a giant firewall. But if you can't have a seat at the democratic table while also trying to haul Twitter officials to jail.
Okay.
Like, it doesn't work both ways.
It doesn't work that way. Is that very quickly, Chandra Bose, time is running out. Is all of this not really helping your image? You're trying to go on Twitter, you're booking Greta Thunberg against FIR. I mean, you're sending notices to YouTube.
See, criticism is always welcome. But if it is fake news and if it is hatred, then obviously some legal steps has to be taken. But I am also going to suggest this holds for both sides. Anybody encouraging fake news, anybody encouraging hatred must be hauled up. It has nothing to do with Twitter. Whoever is encouraging it from whichever side, let's be fair.
Okay.
They should be taken into account.
That's a very worthy sentiment. Unfortunately, it's more in theory than in practice. But let's see how this story plays itself out. It is very fascinatingly poised. I'm completely out of time. Thank you all so much for joining me on Reality Check. Thank you so much for watching. Good night.